How did I get to be this old? My great age can no doubt be attributed to the distribution of free cod liver oil and orange juice by the Brits during World War II. The only part of the war I actually recall was rationing, having to save up coupons for food, for clothes, for everything. Hard to believe that my grandparents were born in the mid-1800s. I have 2 huge Bibles with birth and death dates dating from the early 1800s. It shows that my great-grandfather had many wives. They just kept dying in childbirth, and he'd have to find another. I vaguely remember my paternal grandfather, but not my maternal grandfather. Grandma Perry was probably the greatest influence in my life. I have such wonderful memories of her. She was a very regal-looking and a bit intimidating to my friends. She looked like Queen Mary, Elizabeth's grandmother, hair piled on top of her head, rows of pearls, long skirts. Bus conductors and shopkeepers rarely argued with her. My father was a gentle soul who was happiest striding across the moors with the dogs. He wanted to be a farmer, and I still love the smell of pig food. My mother was the family organizer. She could do anything. Make a fruit cake without fruit or butter or eggs, and all my clothes without patterns, but those knitted knickers were awful. She didn't learn to drive until her 50s and failed her first test for knocking the postman off his bike. In her late 70s, she announced that in Axminster, Devon, it was okay to drive against the traffic in a one-way street. Thus ended her hitherto uneventful driving career. My darling sister Anne, while babysitting, would park me in a variety of locations. I was once heard to complain that I was fed up to the back teeth at a time well before I actually had any back teeth. I hated school and was painfully shy, but was frequently found visiting neighbors unaccompanied and uninvited, but always at tea time. My childhood memories are of rambling English gardens, fruit and vegetables galore, a swing and dogs to play with. Holidays meant a visit to the seaside, Wales, Cornwall or Devon. Christmas was woolly stockings filled with fruit, nuts and sweets, and gifts around the Christmas tree, and carols singing in the church. In high school, I did well in the arts and appallingly in the sciences. I loved English lit, and our drama productions of Shakespeare were pretty high standard. It was so thrilling to be in the majestic Grand Theatre in Wolverhampton, gazing at old sepia photographs of actors. In the late 50s, my school was required to admit inner city kids, who were a discipline challenge for the nuns. For me, it was the start of finding a sense of purpose. A career in occupational therapy gave me the variety I needed, along with lots of challenges, satisfaction, and the chance to work anywhere. The restrictions imposed on us as students in Oxford and the freedom we enjoyed when on hospital practice anywhere in the UK was laughable. My career nearly ended 3 times. Once when I was caught cycling 2 abreast in Oxford High Street. Another time when I was seen riding to school from the wrong direction, the assumption being I had spent the night somewhere I shouldn't have been. And the third and almost final time when it was reported that on my 21st birthday, I was seen leaving the hospital on the back of a motorbike. I'm still in touch with some very dear friends that I made in Oxford. I graduated in the early 60s when the Beatles were living and performing in London, so that was where I had to be, though my salary barely covered the rent. I was madly in love with my boss, an eminent Harley Street shrink with several celebrities on his patient list. The only time he actually noticed me was when I appeared at morning rounds in a very colorful and extremely short outfit. He was heard to exclaim, "Oh my God, is it the garden party today?" Seeking something more meaningful, I joined VSO, volunteers sent by the UK Ministry of Overseas Development to needy parts of the world. Tanzania was then and still is a very poor country. I had the privilege of being there during the time of Julius Nyerere. It was a very hopeful time. I had many adventures, but the names involved preclude details. Barry Sambrook made a wonderful DVD from my dusty and ancient slides. During my time in Tanzania, Rhodesia declared independence. The British High Commissioner left Dar es Salaam, and there was a riot that was featured on the international press and caused my parents some anxiety. At the end of my contract, I sailed south to Durban. The seas were always rough, and passengers were not expected to be hungry. After 2 or 3 days, I staggered into the dining room where the crew were drinking and playing cards, forcing them to ungraciously include me. Apartheid still existed in South Africa. My name was on a list of undesirables due to my association while in Tanzania with an anti-apartheid movement at the University of Dar es Salaam. It took 9 days to cross the Indian Ocean. I had enough money for one night's hotel in Perth, but the hotel burned to the ground. The owner found alternative accommodation for a few of us, which gave me time to find an OT job in a psychiatric day hospital and pay my bills with my first paycheck in 2 years. I knew no one, so I took a second job as a nightclub hostess and met Anne, a PE teacher whose boyfriend had just been sent to Vietnam. She was employed in the same club as a go-go dancer. We became good friends, and one night, after consuming a great deal of Australian brandy, she persuaded me to dance with her. Our first booking was at a club where they hoped we would dance rather scantily clad. Anne eventually had to give it up or lose her teaching job. Too many parents, especially the dads, were enjoying her dancing. I stayed on as Barbecue Jack's executive assistant at a Fremantle dockside nightclub called the Chuckling Bones. During my stay in Oz, I visited rehabilitation centers in every major city to demonstrate the possum environmental control and communication equipment for the severely handicapped, developed in the UK by Reg Mailing at Stoke Mandeville. The director of the Australian Rehabilitation Association opened each demonstration by apologizing for the shortness of my skirts by explaining she's English. My childhood friend Denise was getting married in Wellington, New Zealand, and I was the closest thing to family who could be there for her. I lived in the nurses' residence of a huge psychiatric hospital. At the weekends, I would hitch a ride to anywhere and often return, having spent nothing on food and lodging, owing to Kiwi generosity. I will never forget the horrors of a storm which sank the inter-island ferry Wahine in the inner harbour of Wellington, the day I was booked to travel on it to the South Island. My father died suddenly, and I returned to England to be with my mother. It was a tough year, but I did get to work in a real English pub and a chance to get to know Stephen and Karen, my sister's 2 kids, who with their families are very important to me. In 1969, I emigrated to Canada. My first job was at the Henderson General Hospital in Hamilton, Ontario. The lake looked beautiful the day I arrived. Dofasco and Stelco, 2 steel manufacturing plants which dominated the city in those days, were on strike. At McMaster University, I met Eileen Fedor, who taught me so much about Canada and being Canadian. We also put on some pretty wild parties. I was asked again to organize a tour of rehabilitation centers in all major Canadian cities to demonstrate the British possum equipment for the physically handicapped. We started in Ottawa, meeting Pierre Trudeau and Joe Clark, organized by Walter Dinsdale, a legendary federal MP for Brandon, Manitoba, whose son was a possible candidate for this then unique equipment. During this tour, I fell in love with Vancouver and was thrilled when the Kinsman Rehabilitation Foundation offered me a job. The 70s was an exciting time. There was money for equipment which aided personal independence, and the provincial government of the day was very pro-accessibility. Both for work and pleasure, I traveled around beautiful British Columbia in the glory days of cheap ferries. From KRF, I moved to the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia, who at that time were very supportive of rehabilitation. John Simpson, a mover and shaker in the rehabilitation of the brain injured, encouraged me to start my own rehab consultancy. The creative freedom was a heady but short-lived experience. The opportunity to work with Chapin Key on the establishment of Vancouver's first hospice was a privilege and taught me a great deal about life and death. In 1985, I met Jeff Dean, a widower with 2 daughters, Sandy and Jane, a wonderful, wonderful man and the love of my life. During the 15 amazing years we had together, we traveled to exotic places, attended Karen and Roy's wedding in England, Julie and Steve's nuptials in Barbados, entertained visitors at 8711 Seafair, threw many fun parties in Jeff's traditional English pub rec room, and acquired 5 fabulous grandchildren, courtesy of Sandy and Rick, Jane and Erica. Jeff retired from seaboard lumber sales in 1988. He enjoyed jogging and working out at the gym, studied piano, French, Spanish, and documented his family history back to the 1700s, while discovering Pauline and Mike, relatives living close by. In 1999, Jeff was diagnosed with ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's or motor neuron disease, a certain death sentence. I have many memories of fear and terror, but even more of deep love, compassion, and humor during this time. Once we lost a vital part of Jeff's breathing equipment, and I had to call a technician out in the middle of the night. He was so kind. Later, I discovered the missing part stuck to Jeff's bottom. Jeff dealt with many challenges thrown at him and enjoyed life to the full. I feel so fortunate to have had him in my life and to continue to be close to Sandy and Jane and their families. In the decades since Jeff died, I have visited old friends in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, retired from my last job in community mental health, and been involved in a variety of volunteer opportunities. A highlight being the 2010 Winter Olympics, where I pored over a sewing machine for many long hours in the old BC place and saw the results in the unforgettable spectacle of the opening and closing ceremonies. The proximity of Britannia Heritage Shipyard, which commemorates Steveston's history of fishing and boat building, adds significantly to the quality of my life. But of course, it's mostly the very special people. I look forward to continuing to enjoy both. Thank you for sharing this time with me.